Dobrodošli ponovno na naš večer in na tretjo potenco. Poimenovali smo ga z naslovom Socialno, tržno gospodarstvo, poti in stranpoti. In med nami imamo seveda uglednega gosta, ga poznate, torej gospoda ambasadorja Jozefa Adama Mussomelija, torej ambasadorja Združenih držav Amerike v Sloveniji, v Ljubljani, s katerim se bomo pogovarjali o tej temi. Poskušali bomo seveda odstirati ekonomska vprašanja, ker se nahajamo na ekonomski fakulteti. Med nami so torej študentje, mladi, ki sodelujejo z nami, pa tudi tisti, ki ste sicer zainteresirani, da pridobite kakšno novo znanje. Torej, toliko najprej kot uvodni nagovor z moje strani. And now also in English. So today's evening our language will be English language like usual when we have a guest who is not Slovene. So today is my great honor to host Mr. Josef Adam Mussomeli, an ambassador of the United States to Slovenia. Mr. Mussomeli is always an interesting guest. He is known for his open-mindedness and always willing to share his thoughts on the variety of subjects. He devoted his professional life to serve the U.S. Foreign Affairs Services. He worked in a variety of more or less problematic countries, such as Egypt, Philippines, Morocco, Bahrain, Cambodia, and Afghanistan. Today, he served the U.S. ambassador to Slovenia. He is known for his clear and well-thought arguments. No wonder why Mr. Mussomeli is often a target of a variety of criticism, also provocative and destructive in Slovenia. And he treats it with respect and dignity. Anyway, today we are not going too much neither into politics nor reconciliation, two of interesting topics. We are going to try and talk about economics. I know he's not an economist, but I'm sure he has a broad knowledge also in this topic. Perhaps something about privatization, which is treated with discomfort in our country, maybe something about the banking system and the lending practices of banks that have produced enormous amounts of bad loans. We are for sure going to discuss the social component of the market economy. So I would like to stress the social component of the market economy. To be more precise, Mr. Ambassador is going to address you with his thoughts on the US economy and how business and government incorporate values and ethics in market economy and market-driven economy. After his address, you, our audience, will be given an opportunity to raise your thoughts and questions on the subject. I would ask anyone to stay focused during the address and keep your questions short and clear in order we all can have the best benefit. So, Mr. Ambassador, a very welcome at the Faculty of Business Studies. Please, stage is yours.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for coming. You shouldn't applaud till you hear what I say. You may want to boo instead.
We should hear first.
Yeah. But thank you very much for inviting me, especially at this very interesting time in Slovene history. It seems that during my time here, Slovenes have really taken to heart the old Chinese curse about may you live in interesting times. It's when I took this job, I never thought it would be interesting at all. It was supposed to be relaxing. And my God, Cambodia and Afghanistan were more relaxing. I've not even been here 4 years, and like all of us here, we'll be having our fourth Slovene government in less than 4 years. It's remarkable. It's like you're in competition with the Italians or something. This is off the record, right? But
off cameras.
but I am really delighted to be here. I have prepared remarks of about 10 or 15 minutes, mostly talking about the bilateral economic relationship. That should take about 15 seconds. Then maybe what needs to be done to improve the Slovene economy. That could take about 15 hours. And then the problems of corruption, which we could talk about till we all die. But I was going to touch on those 3 points. One of the points that I don't have in my prepared remarks, but I think is very important, as has just been mentioned, is the social aspect and the moral aspect of an open market and free economy. And I think too often, even before I get to my prepared text, I would say that capitalism, raw capitalism, is in ways just as sinister as raw communism. If it has no human face, if it has no human heart, then it could be very brutal. And so there has to be some component of ethical or moral concern for those who simply don't make it in the marketplace. And that's something that is lost on many people in the free marketers, which I'm one. But there's this, it's almost ironic in the modern age, people question their religious values and their religious beliefs more easily than they question their economic beliefs. The people who are pure capitalists or pure socialists are completely intolerant and can't see any room for compromise or any area where they may be wrong. It's one of the major problems with the modern world, I think. But we could talk about that, and please do ask all the questions you want. I think it'll be tedious to just listen to me read my text for the next 10 minutes, but all the questions, anything, if I don't know the answer, I'll make it up, because I'm a good diplomat. No, if I don't know the answer, if I don't have an opinion, I'll just say I don't know. But I could also get back to you on issues and questions that I don't know. I have never been an economist. I was once an economic officer in Sri Lanka, and I pretended for 2 years to know economy. So I think I could pretend for 2 hours tonight. So if I may begin, as you know, as the US ambassador, one of my top priorities is to promote a level playing field in the business environment here. And it hasn't been easy. I have an obvious self-interest in this. I think that a level playing field will be of clear benefit to US investors. But I also believe that it would really benefit Slovenia and Slovenians at least as much. After almost 4 years here, I can confidently say, with a lot of regret, that Slovenia is not as attractive a place to do business as it should be. And that shouldn't be, because you know you are strategically located, you have a highly educated workforce, and not only that, you have a workforce that speaks English better than I do. You have a first-rate infrastructure. So there's no reason this shouldn't be the jewel of Europe, or at least of Southeastern Europe. And yet, because of the lack of transparency and the shifting of rules of the game, it's keeping investors away. Slovenia has acquired a truly negative reputation in the American business community over the last 10 years. We have seen many examples where US companies have seriously explored Slovenia as a potential home for investment, only to grow discouraged and invest elsewhere. A few examples: Xerox, Hewlett-Packard, Harrah's Entertainment. All these examples create doubt in the minds of many potential investors. Is Slovenia really serious about opening its economy to investment, or is it just paying lip service to keep people happy? Added to these concerns is the prolonged political instability we are now experiencing. I know this, let me digress a second here. I know many of you here will disagree with me on this, but I think all these changes in government have been really irresponsible. When Pahor's government fell, I thought it was really reckless and stupid. When Janša's government fell, I thought it was equally foolish. When Bratashek's government fell, I thought again it was madness. whether they're on the left or right, you need some political stability. And all this constant change has really made people nervous in the business community. Political change, of course, is inevitable and indeed vital for any functioning democracy. My own government, which I'm always ashamed of, has often fallen victim to bickering and deadlock, nearly missing a catastrophic default on our national debt just a few months ago. But Slovenia is now entering another period of profound political uncertainty, followed by the parliament's decision to accept the prime minister's resignation. And to be very honest, if I thought early elections would resolve anything, it would be worth the pain. It would be worth the instability. But almost every scenario that we come up with in the embassy, at least, doesn't resolve the situation. After elections, the situation may be just as chaotic, just as confusing, just as contentious as before. And that's the problem. As political leaders debate their next steps, a long to-do list of economic reforms continues to require serious attention in order to help Slovenia maintain a more positive economic trajectory over the next few years. Fueled by growth in key export markets like Germany, there's an indication that your economy is starting to climb out of recession. But to maintain this and accelerate it, this growth, we hope leaders will seize every opportunity to stabilize, really stabilize the banking sector, which has not been done yet, rein in public spending, which has not really been done yet, and privatize state-owned enterprises in a transparent, rational way, which has certainly not been done yet. Every political leader on the left and the right know this recipe for economic recovery, and if they wanted to, they could collectively find the courage to make the hard and necessary conditions to create this environment. Okay. There are some bright spots.
It was for your break.
I'll take a sip of water.
Yes.
There are some bright spots, and I don't want to paint this as all bleak and dark. There are over 30 U.S. firms here, either investing or with a presence here. A prime example of increased U.S. investment just recently was the laser manufacturer Fotono was sold to a U.S. holding company in January. And a second state-owned company may come up very soon. Other major successes, of course, are Goodyear, which continues to invest, which tells every other company in America that this is the place to invest. But they're rather unique in that. They keep expanding, investing more millions and millions of euros in their tire factory, but they're very rare. And then, of course, the other way also, companies like Studio Moderna are having a really successful business in America. We are also hopeful about the prospects for the EU-US transatlantic trade and investment partnership. The agreement has the potential by 2027 to boost the EU's economy by 120 billion euros, and the US economy by 95 billion euros. This is according to the Center for Economic Policy Research. It also has the potential to add many jobs to the already 13 million American and European jobs supported by the transatlantic cooperation. While direct trade, this is why I said it would only take us 15 seconds to talk our bilateral relationship. Direct trade between the US and Slovenia is small. Only 1.8% of Slovenian exports go to the US, and only 3% of Slovenia's imports are from the US. TTIP offers Slovenian businesses some major advantages. Some of Slovenia's top exports, including automotive parts, are exported to other EU countries where they can become part of larger manufactured goods for the US. Plus, a simplified regulatory structure could make it easier for Slovenian businesses already doing business to export to the US market without bearing the costs of complying with completely different standards and regulations. Moreover, TTIP has the potential to build on the nearly $3.7 trillion we can collectively invest between the US and EU countries. I didn't want to even say those two paragraphs, but my staff made me. The TTIP is something that the US government is pushing very hard throughout Europe. And if I don't want to be removed, I have to mention it every time. And to be serious, it really would be good for Slovenia. If we could get one standard for investment going both ways, I think Slovenia would really help very much. Moving on to the government's role in improving the country's economy, more obviously needs to be done. The current government has worked in the face of serious obstacles to address some economic imbalances and did successfully avoid an EU bailout last year. But now, as the country heads towards yet another snap election, there is even greater urgency to press forward with economic reforms, though we all know that they'll probably be put on hold. We are glad to see credible forecasts predicting Slovenia may emerge from its recession this year, with the European Commission predicting 0.8% growth for this year. But we know that it is too soon to say for certain that Slovenia's future is really assured. And frankly, personally, I think the European Commission prediction is too optimistic. We must recognize that much of Slovenia's improved economic outlook comes from the economic recovery elsewhere in the EU, with 78.5% of all Slovenian exports going to other EU countries. Slovenia's current account surplus at 6.5% last year highlights that the country's sluggish domestic consumption and its reliance on exports for growth. People in Slovenia are too worried, too unconfident, and simply lack enough money to be purchasing and investing as they should. Far more importantly, your political leaders need to address the demographic pressures on pension spending. This is something no government really wants to deal with. This I find a very interesting statistic. Currently, for every 100 working-age Slovenians, there are 46 dependent children or dependent elderly. And by 2060, that number will grow to 86 dependents for every 100 workers, an almost 1-to-1 ratio. Even though the current government did introduce new pension legislation and labor market reform in 2013, it will not be enough. As in the United States, politicians simply do not want to have to deal with a large group of voters who demand no cuts in their Social Security benefits, regardless of the ultimate negative effect on the younger generations. And as I look at the audience, many of you are retired, so you probably disagree with that statement. I'm old too now, so I could say it with a little more sincerity. Then there is the ongoing problem of privatization, which has stalled too many times. There are valuable assets right now up for sale, Telecom, Aerodrome, and NKBM, among others, that are rapidly losing their value, as you know, amid political posturing and inaction. We recognize that the uncertain political environment could delay these efforts, but we urge that they move through quickly, since many Slovenian state-owned companies have accumulated losses, making them even less attractive to outside investors. I've said this often, but I think it's worth repeating that my least favorite Slovenian phrase is, quote, national interest. If it were well-defined, I'm not really radical about this, if it was well-defined, focused policy preserving a handful of strategic Slovenian industries, I could understand it. But instead, the concept of national interest is cynically used to block foreigners from purchasing or investing in state-owned enterprises and allowing friends and allies to be placed on the supervisory boards of state-owned enterprises. Too many corrupt officials have used this term national interest to lull the people into believing that what was in the personal interest of a few was in the interest of the many. Which brings me to my next point. I would like to touch just briefly on the topic that really significantly impairs Slovenia's market economy, has made many Slovenes lose faith in capitalism, and which has the potential to destroy Slovenia's long-term economic success, and that is, of course, corruption. I believe there's plenty of blame to go around for Slovenia's economic problems all across the political spectrum. Much of the pain the country feels today stems from improper and dubious business practices in the 90s and the early 2000s, when Slovenia shifted its economy to a modern, free market European economy, or at least claimed it was doing so. Recent corruption charges against political leaders on both sides of the political divide highlight that cronyism seems to thrive at the highest levels. This is why a strong, independent judicial system committed to upholding the rule of law takes on special importance. Institutions like the Anti-Corruption Commission and the Competition Protection Agency deserve support. Their independence to investigate allegations of wrongdoing and unfair business practices is a critical prerequisite to Slovenia's long-term economic health. As you probably know, the government's plan for privatizing several state-owned firms means that private firms will be negotiating for multi-billion-dollar deals with your government. A lot is at stake for the people of Slovenia if these deals do not adhere to a fair and transparent process, not only for all of you, but more importantly for future generations of Slovenians. Finally, just a brief word on business ethics. I would urge everyone not to stand idle when you see counterparts or leaders seek to evade them. A society which makes exceptions for some cannot long remain economically dynamic and politically stable. It is especially important, especially difficult to uphold ethical leadership during tough economic times. During such times, it is too easy for us to make exceptions and cut corners for ourselves and our friends and relatives. This lack of respect for law has a pernicious effect on our societies, which can set us on a path from which it is difficult to turn back. It may sound crass, but I need to point out the simple profit incentive. Simply put, ethical leadership is good for business. When we, the US government and embassy, speak with potential investors about Slovenia, we are always asked about the country's commitment to the rule of law and transparency. In today's global economy, most investors demand a genuine commitment to a strong code of ethics as a baseline for investment. I think of this, it's a stupid term I made up, but I think of it as the nation's GEP, gross ethical product. This GEP, although an intangible, is a concrete indicator of what investments are sound and likely to be profitable. And without a strong GEP, foreign investors will go elsewhere to invest their money. The great Roman statesman Cicero once said, this is one of my favorite quotes, "We are slaves to the law, so we be not slaves to men." It is important to remind ourselves over and over again that those are the really only two choices we have. And if we want to be a really modern, open, and dynamic economy, we will willingly become slaves to the law and not to men. Thank you. That's all I would say for my formal speech. Thank you. I guess I could, before we even ask the question, since on the corruption issue, I think I would add just two things. People say that it's hard to change. From my experience in my career, one of the best examples of change is Singapore. Before most of you were born in the 1960s, Singapore had one of the most corrupt societies in the world. And yet, by the 1980s, they had turned it completely around by developing such an open and transparent economic system, by giving people good pay and by punishing all those who transgressed, regardless of where they were on the political spectrum. In a mere one generation, they became perhaps the most honest and open place to do business in Asia. The other thing I would say about corruption is to quote Bertrand Russell. He was once asked to conjugate the irregular verb to be firm, and he said, "I am firm, you are stubborn, they are pig-headed idiots. And that's the way we see corruption, because we don't see it when it's us. We think of us as just taking care of people who we love and have helped us out. And when it's our friends, if it's you, you're maybe doing something slightly wrong, but we understand because you're our pal and we know what you've gone through. But if it's some other person on the other side of the political spectrum, then of course that's the real corruption. And that's the problem for all of our countries. We refuse, or as humans, it's very hard to see corruption as something that actually is within those who we love.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for your great analysis of the Slovenian environment somehow, in one hand, and on the other hand, you practically covered almost all fields about which I would like to ask you.
Could I leave?
No, of course not. But first of all, I would like to raise a few questions on your presentation. So, from my perspective, it was, you mentioned or you made 3 or 4 important stresses. First of all is the very small amount of international trade between Slovenia and States. So you mentioned just 1.8% of all the export is the export to US, and 3% of all the Slovenian imports is from US. So this international trade these figures are very low. Do you think that Slovenia is having an appropriate products? You mentioned we have knowledge, but which products, which field of can be the right one for international cooperation? So you mentioned Goodyear. We know Steklarja Rogaška was sold to UK and American funds. Some European funds bought NKBM. On the other hand, the manager from Russia, the owners from Russia are coming to Slovenia. So VBS, so one bank was sold to Sberbank, and so on. So, on your opinion, which area can be interesting for investors?
I think
but let's put aside our habits, ethics, and the lack of ethics, and so
just
on.
What would be attractive if everything were ideal. I'll tell you the things that won't be. First, banks. I think that American banks in general don't want to come this far afield, even if they were great banks, which they're not. But even if they were, I think looking to Austria or Germany or elsewhere is much better. The same with things like Mercator, grocery stores and that sort of thing. It's unlikely for American companies to be focused on that. On the other hand, high-tech companies, and you have some going the other way too, like Collector and companies like that. Because Slovenians have, and I don't want to praise you too highly, but because Slovenians are very talented and have high IQs, and they're really good at engineering and software and computers, things like that. There's all these niche companies in Slovenia that are really dynamic and innovative, like Fotona and others. That are extraordinarily attractive.
But are they prepared to cooperate with foreign companies? Usually I have an impression that people are afraid of people from outside Europe.
Yes and no. And certainly it makes sense that you would be more comfortable with Europeans. You've lived with them for 1,000 years. And so, of course, and those bonds have grown up. But I think, as in so many things in Slovenia, there's really 2 economies here. And there's the old economy, and those people are very suspicious and just uncomfortable dealing with real foreigners like Americans or Asians. And then there's the new economy, the more dynamic, innovative, young group. And they have absolutely no nervousness or worry about or discomfort with Americans or others. There's several Slovene startups in Silicon Valley even, And they feel more at home there than they do in Slovenia. And that's one of the other dangers for Slovenia. You have incredibly talented young people, but they feel stifled and constrained here. And that if they all move to America, that's good for me, but it's not good for Slovenia.
Yes. The privatization is one possible way how to start trade. But do you believe Slovenian government to go few steps further to privatize the companies which are on the list of those companies which should be sold?
Their heart is not in it, and frankly, I'm not even sure if the right-wing governments were that enthusiastic about genuine, full-scale privatization, although they were more so. They will do as much as they feel they need to do. And that's why, in an irony of sorts, if your economy were to start to really improve and you get 1 or 2% GDP growth in the next few years, I think thoughts of privatization will evaporate. It's almost to your benefit to stay in a bad economy for a couple of more years in a long-term sense, because there's no real belief or commitment, certainly on the left, and even on portions of the right, for true privatization, because it's very tempting for any government to have all those, in America we call them plum assignments, where you could select the supervisory boards and choose who will be managing and directing these companies. This is a way to pay off those who you trust and who you owe things to. So to give that up is a very difficult thing, no matter who you are. I would have difficulty doing it.
But at the end of the day, the citizens are paying the costs of this kind of a crony.
They are.
And
once I said that, in a sense, ironically, having a democracy makes it worse, because at least when you were a communist state, you had the same government all the time, so they only had to pay off people once. And you could at least have consistency, bad consistency and competent, but this time, each time there's a change of government, there's changes, and that is actually worse. That's the worst of both worlds.
But the need for an additional money to come into the budget is into the contradiction of privatizing something.
That's why they're doing it.
At the end, there is a national interest. You mentioned national interest. How would you describe the national interest, not in Slovenia, but what should be the national interest?
I think, not to sound too much like a Jeffersonian, but the national interest is always the general welfare of the people, whatever would be best for the most number of people. And in this case, privatization, where you don't want to do a massive privatization where
selling everything.
Yeah, that sort of thing would be damaging to the people. But if you had started off in 1993 or 94 in a very methodical way, by now everything would be privatized, but you would have assurances that the foreign companies would not be leaving Slovenia. They would be investing more in Slovenia. You would be like, in my view, the Singapore of Southeast Europe. You would have very low unemployment and a very dynamic economy. But that isn't what happened, because there is a legitimate fear that being so, and I sympathize with this, when you're this small, you don't want these monster companies coming in and just like locusts destroying your country. But there's a way of taming those locusts, and there were ways of, but what you had instead were homegrown locusts who took over the companies and destroyed them.
But from my perspective, Slovenia is too small for the big or for really, really big international companies to come. Slovenian companies are more useful for those, I know, bigger, so to become a part of international companies, such as the part of a Goodyear or something. So yeah, to have a certain office here and be one brick in the wall.
That's true. I mean, they would be subsidiaries of other companies, but some of your companies are very dynamic and could actually grow and be much bigger, especially in the high-tech area, I think. And if you look at Singapore, they don't have much of a bigger population, and they have smaller geographic location, and they didn't have all the advantages you have at that time. And in Singapore, I don't know the number, but it's thousands and thousands of American companies there, either with investments or at least with presence.
So the level of ethical behavior is also the problem not only in Slovenia but the bigger part in the Eastern Europe. Yeah. Probably because of one of the reasons could be also the past political system or the lack of the good behavior. You mentioned the GEP, so gross ethical product. I imagine this is your figure. It is your index, or it's
just mine.
Just your. And how would you estimate Slovenia? How would you rate Slovenia in the?
You know, if you compare it to the rest of the former communist countries, it's very high, actually. The problem is that Slovenia, quite rightly, demanded not to be judged like Romanians or Bulgarians. They were putting themselves in the same basket with Austria and Germany. And if you put them in that basket, and even in the State Department, we moved you. Slovenia used to be part of the same office in the State Department as the rest of the former Yugoslavia. But a few years ago, we moved you to be with Austria and Switzerland. So, you know, we think of you not as part of that block anymore. So by that standard, that higher standard, you're not doing so well. But that's an extraordinarily high standard. And one of the real funny things about Slovenia, of course, I've spent all my career, 34 years, 30 before I got here, in the third world. And in the third world, corruption and unethical behavior is very obvious because it permeates the whole society. If you walk down the street or you drive down the street and you hit somebody with a car, you just pay the police a few dollars and you go on your way. Or if your house catches on fire, you pay the firemen to put out the fire. Or you need a marriage license, which I did need in Cairo. I had to pay like $400. My wife is still regretting I paid that money. But here the problem is there's no real petty corruption, or very less petty corruption in Slovenia than in America. Slovene police, firemen, doctors, lawyers generally are very honest. The average Slovene almost does a disservice by being so honest because it makes everyone think there's no corruption. And it's not till you get to the higher levels, and then even there, it's not blatant exchanging of money. It's more systemic corruption where you take care of those who are of like political mind or that you know intimately. And so the corruption's of a completely different sort, and it's in a sense it's harder to fight because it's not blatant generally.
Okay, so these were the questions compared with your presentation. The next one will be more, let's say, so theoretical, but I don't expect a theoretical answer. I would like to hear your experiences. What do you think about which are the preconditions for the creativity and richness to evolve? Is it individual freedom, freedom of religion, the rule of law, freedom of speech? How would you assess the level of liberties in Slovenia? So I don't want to discuss now about socialism, liberalism, and so on, but I just want to assess the level of liberties. So the free to speak, free to come together, free to raise your child in a certain way, and so on. So
again, given my experience, I think Slovenia is quite high on all those lists. Room for improvement in all of them, but that's true of America as well. I think what's lacking, and frankly, what I think has eroded in Slovenia over the last 10 years is the rule of law. And that, whether you're a socialist country or capitalist country, whether you're whatever you are, the rule of law is really the fundament of civilized modern society. If you don't have that, then everything else crumbles. You could actually do easier without freedom of speech or freedom of religion than you can without the rule of law. And that, I think, has eroded, partially because of all the media attention to corruption and the actual corruption there is at high levels, but also because of a certain cynicism that has sort of grown within the Slovene population. And really, confidence in the rule of law is the most crucial thing. And if people lose their confidence or faith in judicial systems and political institutions, then everything else starts to unravel. And so that is my fear. It's still reasonably high by world standards, but I see it on a trajectory that's on a decline rather than incline.
Can we somehow combine the rule of law as something normative, so the legislation on one side and the people's insights, so that if I would like to be fair, to be just, this is also quite important. So both sides are important. So the legislation on one hand, and not just education, but also how the parents treating the children. So the schooling is it's also very important. So the schooling system, how to get the education in Slovenia, because you are the guest at the private faculty, let's say so, like a private initiative. Private schooling in Slovenia is strongly disregarded, even discriminated against. Research shows that private schooling is usually better than public one. The more educated families send their kids to private schools, etc. And yet we are not continuously facing problems in financing private vis-a-vis public schools. So citizens or the politicians promise people to get education for free, not just in the ground school, but also in the gymnasia and also in the higher education. So what should, in your opinion, be the prime role of education in the society? Its original mission, like an education first, and then the model of financing and how to support and what to do in this field, because the policy in the field of education is very important for the future generation, for younger people, for their kids, for our kids.
And you know, education is both the most important and the most dangerous thing, and that's why governments want to control it, because even the best intentions, people wind up wanting to mold the children rather than open the children to think for themselves. And this is especially true in a former socialist country where there will be certain unstated principles that they want to inoculate or indoctrinate the children with. I think in a country like Slovenia, private schools therefore take on a certain moral imperative even to have an alternative choice to how to educate the children. I like to think that even the public system will become more open and more I mean, I've gone to a lot of gymnasia over my last 4 years here, and it seems that there is a change. I'd say, ironically, it's at the university level where things are more calcified and rigid, and there's not as much openness and willingness to see different points of view than there is at the lower levels, which is sort of bizarre in America. It's the opposite, of course.
So
for the most part.
You can say, or you would say that to allow private schools to have certain deters in the program. This is good or not?
It
So
is.
It is useful.
I
or
think
not?
it's
So-
very useful. Of course, as an American, I'm being hypocritical by saying that because, especially for religious institutions, we have our First Amendment prohibitions. So in America, actually, Slovenian religious schools are better off than the ones in America because here you at least get some financing and funding from the state. The tuition and such. In America, that would be ruled unconstitutional. I disagree with the Supreme Court on this, but that's the. But I think when you even in America, when you see the benefit of private education, whether it's religious or not, and what a benefit it is to even the tax burden, because if all those kids went to the public schools, they would be overwhelmed. The government is fortunate to have those schools. I think here it's different because you have a different culture and different laws and constitution. I think that the government in general, I know this will sound bad, but I think they coddle children for too long. I think at some point after gymnasia, there should be a means test. If you have enough money or your family has enough money, you should be paying for your college, university education. It shouldn't be free for everybody. It should be free for those under a certain salary, certain income level. And that would free up a lot more money for private schools and for those children who are really destitute in Slovenia, who really need more support. To treat everyone equally is, in a sense, unfair and unequal.
You're right. So I also stress that we should speak about the social component of the market economy. So we can usually hear that market economy is not fair. It is not enough. There are not enough social rights and so on. So often we hear how socialist economy is more social than market economy. And yet we know that people in market economies are better off than their peers in the social economies. The market economy is namely based on free economic initiative, individual ventures, meritocratic rewards mechanism, and the diversity in creativity and talents. Where would you think are the key social components of the market economy? So in what can you stress?
Yeah. First, I would say the socialist economies have never been able to really rival the capitalist open market economies for creating wealth. The best way to create wealth is capitalism. There's no question about that. The problem with unrestrained capitalism is that it becomes very much the haves and have-nots, the dichotomy between them grows every generation, just inevitably from ancient Greece and Rome to today. If there aren't some mechanisms for ensuring that there's some floor for people, some socialist floor, so people don't starve to death or aren't educated or don't have adequate health, then you're going to have social chaos eventually, and revolution and rebellion. But capitalism is the force that really, because it allows for freedom and it allows for creativity, and that's where you get all the dynamic and all the new inventions and the new technologies and everything else, and the efficiencies in even producing old technologies. So, I just finished a book on FDR a couple of weeks ago, and, I think though people in America think he was wrong in many ways, I think his sense that you have to leave, you can't, the flaws of capitalism should not be fixed by killing capitalism, but by making capitalism have a human dimension to it. And how you do that, I think there's a legitimate argument whether that should be a purely governmental role or whether it should be a private role. And I could see the conservative argument in America that if the government does everything for everybody, then it makes certain groups of people, a certain portion of the population, lazy and indifferent. And on the other hand, it doesn't afford people the chance to be compassionate and help out. But the alternative is to leave everything to just private charity. Has never worked.
Yes. So something.
Some sort of mix.
A mix, yes.
But you know, here's a good example from my experience, and why I sympathize with the conservatives. In Cambodia, we would give like $27 million a year to them for different health and poverty and trafficking in persons and all these different things. And at the same time, there were the Maryknoll sisters there who were doing almost as much value for $500,000. Because when the government is involved in doing good work, they do it very inefficiently. And a lot of the money goes to the bureaucracy, the administrative overhead, like the Red Cross. It's like another government. 25% of their money is wasted on salaries. Yes. So there's something to be said for not letting the government do all this, because the government tends to waste and be inefficient. But if you just leave it to private charities, it's...
But how to support this private charity? With a tax relief or because this is also one unsolved question in Slovenia. So the charity is, I don't know, 1.5% in the annual personal tax you can give to the charity organization, and but all other money comes from the budget practically, unless the Caritas is financed separately. But Red Cross and all others, they are financing more or less from the budget. That's the situation here. So would you agree that market economy ensures people their social rights? Whom it ensures social rights, and in which way? So
it's the best way.
You said that we shouldn't allow people to die in the street. So one portion of social rights should be also in the market economy.
You know, and I think this is something else that Roosevelt was the first to say, at least in America. There's not only freedoms from, but there's freedoms for. You're not only free from oppression, free from religious persecution, but you have a positive freedom for food, for livelihood. And I think it's that mix. If you have, again, unconstrained capitalism, it's like unconstrained democracy. Unconstrained democracy is just anarchy by a nicer name. The same with capitalism. There has to be some restraints and some civilized way of allowing enough freedom so there's dynamism and innovation, but at the same time that no one is trampled underneath.
I have a last field to cover, so I would like to speak also about corruption, but before I would like to give the word to you, our audience. So if there are some questions, please raise and ask, Mr. Ambassador. The lady here.
Hi, I'm Mrs. Malone. This is Magdalena Malone. I have lived in the UK for the last 46 years. I left this country in '66 because of the then, how shall I say, unacceptable system of communism. I have found a peaceful country, UK, but I have retained my house, which is known after my family, Mahne Dr. Anton Novachan, which is a house of great importance. But for the last, since the independent Slovenia, I have been very, very disappointed seeing the country really sliding. Wherever I am, there is a continual discussion on corruption, which I know that exists, continual underinvestment in infrastructure, in roads, in bridges. So really that collapse makes me think what's going on. I have personally lived through flaws of laws which have been caused after I inherited my house, my birth house. Flaws where there was falsifications in the courts because somebody wanted to take my land away. There was in police, I see the flaws. Nobody is persecuted when they drive over drunk somebody on the zebra. Their driving license is not taken immediately away. The person drives on freely.
So you are talking about the rule of law. So
the absolute breakdown of the judiciary to carry out strict punishments which a person deserves when he knocks somebody on the zebra and the driving license taken away. Then I have seen so many in the press, people build villas in the national park,
yes.
in the national park, where you cannot even in California national park, you can't even throw a stone, let alone build overnight without permission, actual villa in the national park of Triglav. Well, what's going on?
The situation is really.
Now, another question. How are we going to get on and improve the country? Where are the people who are going to lead Slovenia in a civilized European way? Because at the moment,
I think we cannot change the citizens, but we can do some. Maybe yes, we can change the government, but you heard Mr. Ambassador that we had 4 governments in the last 4 years.
But you know, I think there is throughout history, people always think that the next generation is going to be better than the last, and every new generation is disappointing. Mm-hmm. That was even true of my generation in the 60s, where everybody thought it was going to be a revolutionary change in America. But when I look at Slovenia, I think actually this is a revolutionary change. It's not overnight, but young Slovenians are so different from their elders that there really seems to me that this will be a different country in 20 years. Mm-hmm. Once a certain generation is gone, it really will be a more fundamental change than even America in the 60s. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But
the question here from my colleague.
What do you think are the main priorities of an ideal government that any government should protect, and what are the areas that they shouldn't enter? We can see the trend about the expanding of government all over the world. Yeah. Can a democracy over time becomes a tyranny of people and destroy itself? And is today's political system still the same as your founding fathers imagined it?
You know, this is just my personal view, and I'm very contradictory in my views on these things. On political rights, I'm an extreme libertarian, and on social rights, I'm almost a socialist. I think that on political rights, there's been encroachment even in America on people's privacy, on people's freedom of thought and people's freedom of religion and so forth. I think that why we have, I mean, we go from the basic principle that we all know, government is evil. But the alternative to government is worse. So we all have government. So therefore, the government that intrudes on us least is the best. But I think that's only true on the political sphere. I think on the social sphere, meaning taking care of people, if you have such a government, then all you're doing is giving a level playing field so those who are stronger or more sinister or more unethical or luckier take everything and nothing's left for the others. So I think that government's first and foremost is to do no harm, which means to leave people alone to the furthest extent possible in their private lives and in their personal beliefs. But then, second, although it's contradictory, to ensure the general welfare of the people.
Mr. Cerer, I assume we will go a short comment and the question at the end.
Yes.
Okay.
We know each other, so he knows me what I think about the whole system. You mentioned in your illustration paragraph the cronyism. The cronyism is corruption which is not known in this audience and in the broader audience, Slovenian audience at all. Cronyism is a corruption which was introduced immediately after the destroy of the communistic system, because we didn't have, or we haven't had, till now the lustration. The lustration would be the most important social act to Slovenia, and it was not done because Mr. Kučan has done everything to prevent this illustration. Cronyism means that you don't get any money, and you don't give any money. You give the jobs to all your relatives, you receive your job from other relatives, and so you make a very, very good still work for this. And this is the problem. Like the Udva people are the first one who is on the road to get the jobs. Then are other secret services, then all ex-communist members, and then the other poor people who are on the road. My question is the following. What do you mean should we do as soon as possible lustration? I know very well the Czech system of lustration, which is still now working very, very well, and is one of the reasons for their big economic, moral, social success.
I have to be honest on this. I think if there was going to be a lustration, it had to be when you got your independence.
1991.
I think now it would create such controversy and such dissension in your country. Your society, which is already so terribly divided, would just tear apart.
But how to prevent the cronyism?
But
I have a friend.
But I agree with everything you say, sir, except I would add that there's cronyism also on the right to some extent. Not to the same depth, not to the same extent, but people take care of their own.
That's right. But you must do everything to cut off these networks, because the network is problem. And as soon as you have, it is like an illness. The society is very, very ill when they get the cronyism.
Okay. Nothing to add? So the friend here.
My question is, can privatization solve some of these problems? Because these networks are extremely strong in state-owned companies.
Well, that's certainly
If
true.
privatization executes, what can these old networks do?
I mean, that's the whole point why they've held on to, not the whole point, but one of the reasons they've held on to them, and one of the reasons it's so good to privatize, because it weakens whichever government's in power. There's less benefits to be given out to those who have taken care of them. And to get the economy out of the hands of the government is always a good thing anyway, because they're so incompetent and inefficient. I know, I've worked for government for 34 years. We're very incompetent. But especially when it comes to the real economy. And that would stop the cronyism to some extent. It would still continue in ministries and such and regulatory boards, but there's ways of preventing it there too, with good, strong laws and great enforcement where people are punished quickly and punished harshly for when they deviate from the rules.
always is better and more responsible to deal with your own money instead of the money of the citizens. August?
Well, I just have a simpler question. You said that you work a lot with the young in Slovenia, and I was just wondering if you could tell us, or your comparison, the young in the States and the young people here in Slovenia. For example, like, what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, what are the strengths of the students there, and how...
When I go to gymnasia, they always ask me that.
Okay.
And it's a legitimate question, because there's two things that I think are very important, and it shows the different cultural personalities of Americans versus Slovenians. It's that, when I go to give a talk at a gymnasium, the kids are almost always dead quiet, and they don't ask questions. I have to taunt them and ridicule them and humiliate them before they'll start asking me questions. Whereas in America, they'll always be asking lots of questions, blah, 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 blah. Which is good, except the irony, of course, is that the Slovenian students in general know more, and so their questions would usually be better. Whereas the Americans think they know everything, so they ask all the questions. So it would be nice to sort of have a breeding program where you get the confidence of the Americans with the intelligence of the Slovenians, and then you'd have good people. Yeah, it's really ironic.
Mr. Peter?
Margins may call me Americans people. I have experience because I'm doing the business filters and fire meshes. Yeah. So just remember that we start a huge business with American people since 1992. It was very funny when the first American came into Slovenia, because they would like to see who we are, if we are producing. The first man who is coming to airport, you mentioned aerodrome to be privatized. Yeah. His question was, the first question, is this private aerodrome? Because it's very small, like American is everything. This was his first question. Yeah. Yes. And the second question, what you do with the border with Bosnia? I mentioned we put another state. So I would say that Americans do the business. It's quite simple if you know your business. Yeah. But everything is there huge, enormous for Slovenian or any production. Yeah. Until we have been competitive with our labor cost, with the cheap material from Eastern Socialno states, Slovakia, Czech, Russian, we have progress. We have been export containers like Chinese today, yeah. But the same way, I always remember these people. I always discuss with anyone by phone, yeah. Interesting, they don't know me. I have never been in America, yeah. The first discussions or second, they ask me, Marjan, what is your religion? I always say Catholic. Oh, good, you are Catholic. Impressive. Why? They always ask, why they ask me? They need the people who trust to deal with something wrong. I always tell it what will happen, yeah? And they always, what is important, have an answer next day. When it's coming to visit, we try with some other people in Slovakia and Czech, but we wait 1 week to have answer. You have next day, you reply. The story, nobody tells the truth in Slovenia. Eh? We have people from New York coming, the big group, try to make joint venture here, 1999. You know where was Bill Clinton here? 23rd of June, yeah? 26th is coming this man, with vice president of the company, with his wife, yeah? We discuss in the company of joint venture, they ask what is benefit of the labor cost, there's no problem, salaries, okay. What the people have, how could you fire on the employers? It's almost not possible, 6 months we need to keep. How you not need the workers, how you not able to fire on? It's simply impossible. It is cost, how you will survive? As the government, it's government law. Every question was how much it cost, who paid the lunch, where's going these people, the restaurant, it's lunchtime. Question is also ethics. When we come into the, you know where it's starting corruption also, not only this level, Slovenia. You need to ask ourselves, what is EU community? When they release not the taxes from Chinese goods, it's coming in EU. Metal products, it's coming in Slovenia, it's a lot of metal works, yeah? Okay, in America, it's squeezing the prices, it's okay. They always keep their words, even we have 4 pages, even one small orders, yeah? Payment is coming, what we agreed, perfect.
So,
But whenever the first case, we get prices from China, we have this price, we will give you this order margin if you accept it. Sorry, we are not in China, yeah?
so
Immediately we are finished with the job, yeah? Especially when they change the people, yeah?
so the
Coming
question,
from
the
us.
question could be,
No ethics more, no questions, what is our labors, our trusting since years. Immediately go to the others.
so the question could be, are we too expensive for the American market?
That's the question.
So, do we have higher costs in Slovenia or
No. I have
in
never
the
come
Central
across
Europe?
a single American.
Because of these social rights? That's
I agree with
I
half of the
mentioned,
concern.
sorry, Joseph, another story. This man is also tell we have very cruel system, yeah? Confirm to me, because okay, it's very difficult to fire on the man, yeah, employers. But next day, or when it's needed, you can employ again. Come to Ribnica, to the villages where you have factories. It's no people.
That's right.
You need to come.
You-
You will see. I mentioned Marian
The,
big, and when it's come to visit, I open one window, mountain, another window, white animals, mountains. How can I think big?
The labor costs. On the labor costs, I would say no American company has ever complained about the salaries. The Slovenian workers do get higher salaries and wages, but that has never been the impediment. The impediment has been the other part of this, the inflexibility of the labor market, not the cost of the labor market per se, but that you can't fire people. Like there's several people in my embassy I've been trying to fire for years, but I can't. It's just, and it's, that sort of thing drives American crazy. Or that if they have one job, you can't move them to another position in Slovenia. So that is one of the major, and the other thing is the red tape. If I had to say 2 things about investment here, it's the lack of flexibility in the labor market and the red tape going through your bureaucracy. And the big example we always give is Harrah's. Harrah's, the casino company, was going to invest €1 billion in Slovenia about 8-9 years ago. And they had the president of the country and the prime minister of the country and the finance minister and the econ minister all agreeing to it. But you also have to get the church to agree and the mayors to agree and the environmental groups to agree and the trade unions to agree. So you lost €1 billion because of all the red tape and all the different interest groups that have to be. You need a place where you just go one place and that's, you deal with one entity.
Mitya?
Actually, you mentioned the famous word of Cicero about we should all be subjected to the rule of law, not to the rule of man. But at the end of the day, we are all actually subjected to the rule of man, no matter what we think about the laws, because it's people who are deciding about the laws, aren't they? Especially on one hand, the judiciary, which is explaining the law and the legislative framework, and on the other side, the process which ensures the rule-making mechanisms. So my question would be, what would, in your opinion, be needed in a society in order that the legislation is as objective as possible, in order not to infringe the people's rights too much and give people from the judiciary too much free power to decide who's right or wrong on a normative basis? And on the other hand, what would be a key necessity for the people working within the judiciary I mean judges and the prosecutors, what would be the key, so to say, necessities or the standards that we should follow in this respect?
Yeah, you know, Slovenia is also unique in this, in my experience, because in most countries I go to, the problem with the judiciary and the politicians is that they're uneducated, they're incompetent, they don't know what they're doing, and they don't have the experience or expertise. In Slovenia, that's not really the problem. The lawyers and judges and prosecutors and even most of the politicians I meet are rather well-educated and intelligent people and have experience. The problem here is something maybe more subtle but more sinister, in that the people's political agendas blur and blind them sometimes to their need to be objective. And even when they are objective, I fear that what's really happening in Slovene society is nobody believes they're being objective. The plain truth of the matter is, if Jankovic were to stab somebody in this room today, 20% of the people would never believe he did it, even if it were on video. And if Janša stabbed somebody in the room today, another 20% would never believe it. There's a certain cynicism and disbelief that the judiciary has lost so much of its integrity or credibility among the Slovene people that it's worrisome, because it's judiciary ultimately that we have to count on to be objective and not allow their emotions or their political preferences to hold sway. This was a big thing in America, and sometimes we fail in America on this too. But the big Supreme Court decision last year upholding Obamacare, as it's now being called, and Chief Justice Roberts voted in favor that it was constitutional, and all the conservatives were outraged that he would do this. And he tried to explain, I think this is a bad law. I would never have voted for it if I were a senator or congressman, but I'm not, I'm a judge. And I have to base it on the Constitution, not on what I think would be a better law. And that's sort of inculcating in the judiciary of both our countries that sort of conviction that it's not up to you to decide what's a better law, or whether somebody, because you know he's a bad guy, that he's guilty of a particular thing. It takes a long time to develop that sort of institution.
But how to supervise judiciary? So how to set up you're not explaining perfectly, in my opinion, so to say, in general, how the way should be, how to ensure that the judges themselves will be objective, no matter what the civil society thinks, that they will follow strict objectives.
Yeah, I don't think there is a perfect, we'd struggled with this in America for 100 years, because originally all judges were for life, and the only way you could get rid of them was through impeachment. And that's still true in the federal system. And a lot of states changed that in the 1870s, 1880s, and so on, because they were finding that the judges were becoming corrupt and they were so protected that they could do whatever they want. So they went to re-electing them every 7 years or 10 years, or recalling them, where if you had, 50,000 signatures or something, you could actually recall judges. And that seemed like a great idea at the time, but it created a different set of problems, where the judges were now more pressured to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, or making convictions in controversial cases because they didn't want to be recalled. And so then it became, they were almost just extensions of the mob mentality, because they weren't insulated enough. And where that balance is, I don't know. I lean more toward erring on the side of having judges that will let their own personal biases ruin their decisions than having them intimidated by the masses. But I don't know we've tried both in America, and neither is perfect.
But the legislation in Slovenia is changing so practically daily, on a daily basis. Are our laws just?
Ooh. Have to ask Socrates.
Yes.
I mean,
Because there is some tradition, but not the long one.
no, but I think just comes. You look at it objectively and subjectively. What was the intent? I mean, a lot of laws are unjust in America and Slovenia in the sense that they're to cater to or to accommodate a certain narrow group of people. And then there's objective and unjustness that even if they intended good, the result has turned out badly. But I couldn't say in general if what is true of. I think that for the most part, Slovenes on the left and right, when they're in parliament especially, they're trying to find laws that they think are just. I think the intentions are usually good. It's just that they're fallible and stupid.
I meant because so many laws changed just because to reach a certain goal. I don't know. We have those tables for operations a few years ago, and it was tremendous political pressure to change the law on public procurement just only for the sake of this operational tables or for operations and so on.
That happens in America all the time too.
Oh, okay. No. I don't want to finish our discussion with the negative effects of corruption. I prefer to raise the question about motives behind such acts, the reasons that drive coercive behavior. Is this culture, bad experiences, the lack of values, the strong individualism? Which are, on your opinion, the motives for corruptive acts?
In Slovenia.
In Slovenia, yes, in Slovenia.
I think part of it is the communist regime, that for a long time you were in a society where if there was accountability, it was done in a very secret way, and the people didn't have any real participation in it. So I think that breeds it's not Slovenian culture so much because that goes back 1,000 years or more, but the near-term past history has been one where the people didn't participate and where the institutions of government did everything. And so that created a sort of temporary culture, if you want to say, where corruption can breed quickly. I think beyond that, I think also you have to remember that you're very young people. I mean, you're only 23, 24 years old, and that's not very old to develop the institutions of a modern day democracy. It took us at least 150 years, closer to 200, and we're still ironing out wrinkles in how our government should operate. 24 years is simply too short a period with not having had, at least the Americans had 100 years or more of self-government before they became the United States of America. You didn't have that. And those things have to grow slowly. So I think that's another problem. You have to just be more patient with yourselves. And beyond that, I think the size of the country is a serious problem. I think that
we know each other.
Yeah, and for the good or bad. I mean, you're more like a city in America. And where's the corruption in America? It's not on the federal government level so much. It's in the cities. Because people need to do favors for each other. People know each other. And you have Mayor Daley in Chicago or something like that, or Yui Long somewhere in the South, and you're taking care of people. It's a smaller number. Everyone knows you, or you know everyone. You know who your enemies are, and who your friends are, and that sort. Ironically, the smallness of the country, I think, breeds that sort of institutional corruption, systemic corruption, rather than the exchanging of money and things like that.
Yes, I can agree with you.
Those, I think, are actually, I think the moral, from my take on Slovenians at least, is that they're extraordinarily moral. That isn't the issue. I think their values as a people, even though they're divided politically and ideologically,
So
I think they actually share many common values.
So you can say that we have a kind of a right measure to measure the degree of criminalized acts in Slovenia. So we know what is a corruption,
Yeah.
what is a criminal.
Unless it's a friend. And then it goes back to what I said about Bertrand Russell. Yeah. Our friends are never corrupt. It's always the other guys.
Okay. And just the last question from my side to maybe to finish in a more positive way. So what would you suggest younger generation to do?
Move to America.
No,
joking.
Brain drain. So what can you put on their hearts to do, to be more initiative, more productive, in your words, please?
I think you all need to listen respectfully to your elders and not pay attention to what they say. I think it's very important to be respectful and also disobedient. I think that I really do have hope for this latest generation of Slovenians because they're not trapped in the same way in the history of the past as the older generations. And they really have an opportunity to create a new Slovenia, a really new entity and culture and consciousness. So I don't think they could ever break from the past because they're raised by those who lived in the past. But I think because of their outward look, even 10 years ago, Ambassador Young, my good friend, always said that Slovenians were very introverted, not only in how they dealt with people, but they always looked inwardly, and they didn't look out to the rest of the world. And that has changed in the last 10 years pretty profoundly. And I think they don't need advice from me. It's going to be a more dynamic and open society.
Thank you. Mr. Mussomeli, thank you for your opinion. Thank you also for your great answers and all the thoughts you shared with us. Hvala tudi vam, da ste se udeležili na to lepo popoldne tega večera in tudi s tem pokazali podporo tistemu, kar delamo na fakulteti za poslovne vede. Vabim vas še na več pogovor, eden z drugim v sosednji prostor in vidimo se kmalu. Nasvidenje.